Some of this will have already been kind of alluded to in the film that we've just seen, so I'll try and condense it quite quickly. If we could go to the next slide. So the COP26 meeting that's happening this week in Glasgow has been prefaced by a really stark report from the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was described by the UN Secretary General as a code red for humanity. It's outlined the scale of humanity's impact on our planet. In 2019, the concentration of carbon dioxide recorded in our atmosphere was the highest in the last 2 million years. The global surface temperature has warmed since 1970 at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. Meanwhile, global mean sea level has risen faster since 1900 than over any other preceding century in at least 3,000 years. This human-made climate change is already leading to more extreme weather in every region across the globe, with the frequency and intensity of heat waves, heavy rainfall, droughts, tropical cyclones, all increasing significantly since the 1950s. And I think this graph really shows just the rapid change that kind of industrial life on planet Earth has really had on our climate. Next slide, please. So the time to act is now, with every tonne of CO2 emissions adding further to global warming. Global temperature is now expected to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees of heating relative to pre-industrial levels within the next 2 decades. Without a rapid reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, reaching at least net zero carbon in the coming decades, global warming of 2 degrees, which was the upper limit set by the Paris climate meeting a few years ago, that's likely to be exceeded within the next century. If emissions remain high, global temperatures could increase by more than 5 degrees by 2100. The last time that global surface temperature was sustained at or above 2.5 degrees higher than pre-industrial levels was 3 million years ago. So the environmental conditions that have sustained human civilization could be gone in a few decades. So in other words, the climate emergency is already here, and unless we decarbonise social and economic systems at speed and at scale over the next couple of decades, the consequences for ecosystems, economies, communities around the world, particularly the most disadvantaged, will be significant. Next slide, please. But what does this mean for Liverpool in particular? So, along with the rest of Europe, the Liverpool city region can expect average temperatures to rise more rapidly than the global mean. This will increase the intensity and frequency of extreme hot weather events. Intensified by the urban heat island effect in particular, cities such as Liverpool and their populations will suffer from more severe heat stresses during periods of extreme hot weather. Areas in northern Europe in particular can expect more severe windstorms and more frequent heavy rainfall. And urban design means that cities are more vulnerable to the threat of flooding as those heavy rainfall events become more common. Coastal cities such as Liverpool city region face the additional threat of sea level rises and increased flooding from storm surges. The IPCC report notes that some degree of continuing sea level rise as a result of historical ice cap melt and warming is now almost certainly unavoidable. So that climate change is baked in regardless of what we do now, and it's about how do we mitigate those negative effects getting worse. Next slide, please. So this was in the Liverpool Echo just in the last week. I don't know if anyone saw it. So here we can see one projection of what sea level rises could mean in Liverpool within the next 10 years, with even greater risk projected for other coastal areas of our region, including Sefton and the Wirral. These climate shocks threaten lives, livelihoods, home and businesses, our infrastructures and our economic prosperity. Next slide, please. So what needs to change? As I said at the start, only a concerted and rapid transformation of global and social economic systems, the ways we live, work, get around, is now sufficient to avert. The scale and complexity of this challenge can seem overwhelming and disempowering, but any global transformation necessarily requires local action. So what needs to change in Liverpool and in the Liverpool city region? Next slide. So this is a really useful infographic. It's a couple of years old, but I think the message that it gets across is a really good one. In 2018, Liverpool emitted 2,580 kilotons of carbon dioxide, which is equivalent to 4 tons per resident per year. And although we've been doing really great work to decrease our carbon emissions, Recently, the rate of decrease has started to shallow, and we still have a long way to go to get to zero. And I think this is really stark. This is 2 years old, and it was telling us that we had 6 years left of carbon budget. So rapid change is required if we're going to get to the local target. The city region target is to reach net zero by 2040. That's going to require really rapid and significant change. Next slide. So again, as I said at the start, the time for tokenistic and piecemeal action is over. Only coordinated and sustained action to address the climate emergency at the system level, rapidly decarbonising the totality of urban life in places like Liverpool in an integrated and synchronised fashion will be sufficient. This means understanding how our city, how our neighbourhoods, how our communities, our economies currently function in a way that is carbon intensive and unsustainable. At the moment, our current system makes it really easy and really cheap to pollute the planet and burn carbon. That needs to change. So if you could just, our energy system remains reliant on burning fossil fuels to generate energy, power industry, fuel transport, heat our homes. Can you touch it again? So this is exacerbated by a high proportion of ageing, low quality and energy inefficient homes in the city region. Nearly 2/3 of homes in the city region have a EPC rating of D or less. Next. So our transport system also remains highly carbon intensive with a real reliance on cars. Taking just the Liverpool Wavertree constituency area as one example, more than half of all journeys to work are made by car, compared to just 11% by foot or 2% by bicycle. So there's a lot that needs to change. Next one. And this reliance on cars is particularly exacerbated by the fact that many neighbourhoods remain disconnected from affordable, reliable public transport that gets them to and from where they need to go, and also having good local services on their doorstep that can reduce the need for travel overall. Next slide, please. So this system is not just incompatible with net zero carbon emissions, it is harmful to our natural environment and impacts air quality. The whole of Liverpool has been deemed an air quality management area as a result of concerns over air pollution. This exacerbates poor health and well-being in our communities. Average life expectancy in Liverpool city region is around 2 years lower than the rest of England, and those figures that there is real great inequality between the most and least deprived areas of our region. And almost 1 in 4 people of working age has a limiting illness or disability. Our current system also exacerbates inequality. Pollution and poor health are worse in our most deprived areas. Energy inefficient housing intensifies fuel poverty, and a lack of affordable and reliable public transport options limit people's access to employment and to opportunity. So what is required is nothing less than system change, but at a local level. Next slide, and the next one. When in a previous life, I worked for the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority, and whenever we were having kind of conversations about environmental policy or economic policy, when people were asking the question, what needs to change? I used to say, look out of your window, everything needs to change. Most of these buildings are going to be not maximally energy inefficient, and certainly will be reliant on carbon intensive energy to heat and power them. The cars on the streets, very few of them are likely to be electric vehicles. The cycling infrastructure is not in place. The ships that are coming into our ports don't have access to ship-to-shore power, so they're sat burning their engines. When you see the cruise ships coming in, they're sat burning their engines overnight. So everything, when you look out the window, if we're going to hit net zero carbon, everything needs to change. Next slide, please. So this change needs to begin with our energy system. Locally, there are ambitions for Liverpool City Region to establish itself as the UK's renewable energy coast. Already, the Burbo Bank offshore wind turbines in Liverpool Bay, some of the biggest wind turbines in the world, and they provide enough energy for over 300,000 homes a year. The proposed Mersey tidal project could generate reliable, clean electricity for up to 1 million homes, whilst also potentially creating thousands of jobs in the process. The problem with that, though, is it's a mega infrastructure project that's incredibly reliant on central government funding. It needs all the support it can get. Liverpool City Region is also a focal point for the HyNet Northwest project, which aims to use clean hydrogen as a replacement for fossil fuels in industry, transport, and our homes. But I suppose the question for today is, what can we do at a more local community level to transition to renewable energy? One kind of policy idea that I'm really interested in is around the model of community solar gardens. These are already established in a number of neighbourhoods in the United States. This involves small-scale solar systems that are owned by members of the community who invest into the scheme as subscribers and then receive credits towards their own energy bills in return for the energy that is sold to utility companies. In London, this idea has been picked up already by an organisation called Energy Garden, which has introduced a similar scheme, transforming unused land at railway stations and other kind of publicly owned land into community-owned gardens that include solar panels. And not only are these solar gardens good for the environment, but they are also really good for people's well-being, with Energy Garden estimating that their projects have helped save local NHS mental health services over £160,000 a year. Next slide, please. Decarbonising our housing is also going to be critical, with around 80% of the housing that we'll be using by 2050 already built. This means that a key emphasis needs to be on improving and upgrading our existing homes, as well as bringing in higher standards for the new homes that are being built. There's a lot of activity going on already in the city region to install insulation, replace inefficient boilers, invest in double glazing. Liverpool City Region Combined Authority is committed to a programme of housing retrofit which aims to bring 10,000 homes up to EPC rating C within the next decade. Importantly, EPC rating C is not net zero carbon. Unfortunately, as well, this is only the tip of the iceberg. So if we're going to hit net zero carbon, every single one of Liverpool City Region's 720,000 homes is going to need to be decarbonised through insulation, through changing boilers, through other programmes. The cost has been estimated for that is £12 billion. This is a massive, massive project. It's going to be really hard, and it's going to require collective effort, and it's going to require pressure on national government as well as local government. But as I said, it's also important that we ensure new housing developments support our net zero carbon future. One approach that's being used around the world is to introduce passive house standards on new build homes. This is what's demonstrated in the diagram here, which maybe you can't see too well, but the idea around passive house is to deploy exceptional levels of insulation, ventilation, and energy efficiency to create homes that are both sustainable but also comfortable and good for people's health as well. We know we've got really poor building standards here. So this is not just important for our environment, but it's also important for public health as well. And as I say, cities around the world, including Vancouver and Oslo, have already begun to set zero carbon targets for homes and buildings. And I think that's a really important thing that we should be considering here as well, to show that commitment to health and well-being of our residents, but also of our natural environment. Next slide. And our transport systems also need to be revolutionised. We are seeing incremental change. We've got a new fleet of energy-efficient trains coming into the Merseyrail network. We've got new double-decker hydrogen buses coming onto our bus routes with the Northwest's first hydrogen refuelling facilities. And work has begun on a 600-kilometre walking and cycling network. But at the same time, we're seeing continued public investment in carbon-intensive transport infrastructure, not least in public loan money that's going to John Lennon Airport, and investment in Liverpool's cruise terminal, which, as I said before, pumping out diesel fumes into our city. And whilst it could be argued that such investment supports jobs and the economy, the question has to be asked, is this compatible? Does this align with our net zero carbon future that there is an imperative to achieve in the next few years? Again, how can we think about transport at the community level? What can groups like Love Wavertree be thinking about? Here I'm really inspired by the 20-minute neighbourhood model, ensuring that each resident is able to access high-quality goods, services, opportunities, experiences within a 10-minute walk in each direction of their home. This approach would not only help to cut down carbon emissions as people travel across the region and across the country less, it would also help to promote thriving local economies. However, initial analysis by colleagues at the University of Liverpool has found that within this city, currently only barely 20% of neighbourhoods currently kind of fit the definition of being a 20-minute neighbourhood. Next slide, please. Very quickly, I also wanted to raise the idea of how we start building a more circular economy. It's important that we increase recycling rates, reuse materials, extend the lifespan of products to help cut down on the energy required to process raw materials, manufacture goods, construct buildings, and prevent waste, microplastics, polluting our environment further. As one example, the City of Amsterdam aims to halve the use of new raw materials in the city by 2030, and they expect to achieve a fully circular city by 2050. Meanwhile, Merseyside saw a 0.6% drop in its recycling rate last year, while overall waste has grown. So we're moving in the wrong direction. Next slide, please. It's important to remember that we face a twin climate and ecological emergency. Liverpool City Region is really lucky in that we're home to a wealth of natural spaces and landscapes, not least our parks and our coastlines. These landscapes provide vital habitats for wildlife, but they're also spaces for people to relax, exercise, and enjoy fresh air. Nurturing our natural environment will be vital as we seek to enhance our city's resilience to climate change. Green and blue spaces act as vital sources of urban cooling, water drainage, air quality management. And so investment in nature-based solutions is going to be increasingly necessary to strengthen local resilience to extreme weather events. As one example, with a similar climate to Liverpool City Region, Copenhagen is responding to the threat of more extreme rainfall through an integrated system of green streets, as you can see in the top right here, through green streets and pocket parks that function as retention areas and water basins when there's kind of cloudburst rainfall. Not only is this green infrastructure helping with effective water drainage, but it's also helping to aid urban cooling during heat waves and to reduce carbon emissions. Importantly, I think it's important to note as well that these kind of measures will help to mitigate the serious economic disruption and threat to public health as climate change accelerates further, whilst also obviously kind of improving our living environments for communities to enjoy. One idea for kind of the hyper-local level for thinking about on the community level to nurture the natural environment is converting more street space into green space, making more of our communities more like parks. And this has been trialled successfully in Hackney, where communities can apply for grants of up to £250 to design and manage pop-up parklets. So it's the combination of supportive local government with kind of organisation at the community level to help transform local places. Next slide. And then this is where I kind of want to leave you on, is it's imperative that our transition to a net zero Liverpool is a just transition. This means ensuring the shift to sustainable ways of living, working, getting around are affordable and accessible to all, with support from government to make the transition as easy and seamless as possible. For example, through significant subsidies for green home improvements. And that's something that local organisers should be putting pressure on local national government to support. The transition must also pay the highest dividends to those who are most disadvantaged. This means realising fully the gains for improved health, well-being, quality of life, that more sustainable transportation, higher quality housing and enhanced natural capital can offer in our most deprived communities. It also means supporting all people to access the skills, technologies and opportunities that will enable them to thrive in new green jobs as carbon-intensive industries are scaled down. There's a real opportunity for a green industrial revolution in Liverpool City Region in particular, and it's an opportunity to rebuild the wealth of local communities if it is embraced successfully and effectively. With around 27,000 people already employed across the renewable energy, low carbon technology and clean growth sectors in the Liverpool City region, there is scope to grow this further. And finally, whilst the need for decarbonisation is urgent, this transition simply can't be done to the public by well-meaning policymakers. Instead, the transition to net zero must be designed, developed and delivered with and by communities themselves. We've already seen the Citizens' Assembly model in the film. There's also been local versions of this held in places like Camden, Oxford, in the north of Tyne, Combined Authority region up in Newcastle. And as we've seen, that's one mechanism through which local people can actively shape the transition to net zero in their communities and ensure this is delivered in a way that's fair and effective. And then finally, just to leave you on, I suppose, a question is, one way to ensure a just transition could be to move towards a donut, what's called a donut economy model in Liverpool City region, which is the diagram here. So such a model challenges existing conceptions of economic success, shifting away from an emphasis on profit-led economic growth and instead towards maintaining an economy that delivers for people, communities and the natural environment first and foremost. So it's about making sure that our economy can exist within the ecological ceiling, the limits of our planet, whilst also ensuring that it's delivering for people and communities. And whilst that's really intuitive, I think it's important to highlight that it has potentially really radical implications for how we think about our economy, the purpose of our economy, but also how it can be controlled more democratically, and we can ensure that it's working for people, for communities and for our planet first and foremost. So yeah, on that note, I'll end my presentation, but thanks very much for listening. I really look forward to the Q&A.
Belinda Tyrrell. I'm a research associate at the Heseltine Institute. I work with James, but the work I've done more recently is on public participation with research and policy development. And this is something that's quite important to me, both as a researcher and as a resident, because I've experienced the participation in community development and planning from a young age. I was growing up in Liverpool. My dad and our neighbours set up a housing cooperative because we were in an area that was earmarked for demolition. And we decided as a community that we wanted to stay together. We didn't want to be separated, and we didn't want to move away from the places and people that meant a lot to us. So as a researcher, I try to think, how can people's lived experiences like that feed into policy? How can decisions that are made that affect people's lives, not just for a generation, but multiple generations, how can the community be brought into that ongoing dialogue about those decisions? So if we just flick through to the next slide, I just wanted to briefly talk about two of the research projects that we've been involved in the last year. One is that, sorry about this, just the next slide. Again, sorry, if we just click through that. One was the City Conversation, which was a partnership project between the Heseltine Institute, Liverpool City Council and My Club More, which was in the Club More area of North Liverpool. And that was a funded research project where we took an asset-based approach really to find out what people liked about the area, what things they wanted to change about the area, and how the local authority could build that into their planning. So if we just go through to the next slide. So the idea of this project was really to train a cohort of community researchers, and just thinking about the film that we saw previously in the Citizens' Assembly approach, I just thought it might be useful just to share this with you. So we worked with the organisation for a number of months. Sadly, the project was derailed a little bit by COVID. We couldn't do a lot more of the creative work that we wanted to do in the community. But we trained over 20 community researchers whose job it was to go out and interview friends, neighbours, conduct open events like this one to get people's feedback on not just what was wrong with My Club More, but what was strong with the area and what things did people value. Because too often maybe we look at the statistics like the indices of multiple deprivation and think that's everybody's experience of an area. but actually listening to those voices and bringing it into just that ongoing dialogue of how we develop policy, how we make changes. And just picking up the point that James said, really, that policy shouldn't always come from top down. People's voices should be included within that. So we did some initial data gathering. One of the things that we've started to do with the project is to build a profile of the area with My Club More, which really tackles the things that people felt were strong and the assets that they wanted to keep, the things they enjoyed about the area and the strength of their community bonds. If we just flick through to the next slide. So it was an opportunity as well, this project, to test whether these participatory approaches worked. And it was also as well an opportunity to maybe share the knowledge gained in the Liverpool City region with other areas across the UK. And we felt as well the importance of local leadership at community level really came along with this, and its leaders at different levels as well. So often you think as a leader for a group or committee, but how people interact with each other in the neighbourhoods, the type of work that people do, and how those connections really make the neighbourhood the place where people want to reside in. We go through to the next slide. So, and just the next one, sorry. So really thinking about the role of this project, we were able to find that there is a role for this type of work within the wider Liverpool City region as part of the People Power Partnership. And some of the legacies that we created from this project include a toolkit for research practitioners and a report which details all of the steps that we took as part of the project, what the outcomes were and what the next steps were for the project. And I just thought the researchers' toolkit might be something that's of a particular interest to Love Wavertree as you build the citizens' assemblies, really, because it's just a helpful guide to some of the steps that we took as part of the project. And if we just go into the next slide, a similar project we've been working on at the moment is with St Helens Metropolitan Council, and it's called Bridge the Asset Gap, and really again that's taking an asset-based approach to neighbourhood development, so building on the 20-minute neighbourhood concept, working with people within the local authority and community groups to find out actually what they think strong about their area and what services they would like to see be pulled into their area. If we just go on to the next slide. So part of the steps there was some mapping that we did of the assets used in GIS. We formed ongoing collaborations with the new St Helens localities model, which you may have seen in the Liverpool Echo the other night. And the aim was really to explore what gaps there was in the social infrastructure of the area and what policies had led to those gaps and how we could maybe use the findings of this project to influence further planning. And next slide. Oh, I've cut myself off there. I've got to apologise as well for that because I did this. I was making some changes this afternoon and my cat decided to join me on the keyboard. So yeah, that's it. I've kept that short and sweet because I'm conscious the longer I talk, the more high-pitched and faster I get, and I'm quite conscious as well people might want to absorb today's result at the match.
So I just want to sort of get your opinion and ask you, what is the sort of balance or the thoughts behind the balance between the sort of making lots of small individual changes to everybody's lives and everybody's individual house and upgrading all the houses, which to me seems incredibly complicated and really long-winded and a long-term goal, to something much more quick and easy, expensive, but a single decision that actually we're going to cap all travel within a 5-mile radius, 10-mile radius of the city centre at £1.50 a day, whether it's bus, train, whatever. Are there any thoughts or research or developments around that, really?
Yeah, no, really, really good question. So I think how best to answer the question. So I think you're right in that it's incredibly difficult to imagine a path to net zero that rests on lots of people having to make the expensive changes to their daily lives based on their own personal motivations to do that. I think this is a collective action problem and it's going to require collective action, and ultimately that is why we have that is why we have governments. It's to help us through tricky collective action problems that require either regulation, require market intervention, or require really significant investment in things like energy systems. I think in terms of what some quick wins might be, I think we absolutely need to decarbonise our energy generation in this country as soon as possible. And as I say, projects like the tidal project in the Mersey Estuary could really help with that. I think on housing, we need to bring in minimum standards on housing, as has been tried elsewhere. And we also need to start kind of subsidising the technologies that will help people to decarbonise their homes, and make that less an individual burden, but one that we collectively share as a society, that we, in the way that we all share the costs of each other's health care. We need to share the costs of each other's decarbonisation. And then on transport, I think there are really interesting kind of policy responses to this. The problem is that we have things like deregulation of the bus services, which is currently up for question in Liverpool, and there's different models on the table, but returning bus franchising, which would see a model similar to London's, would allow more kind of public control over public transport pricing, which could help to kind of encourage more people to take public transport, could help with the reliability and the access to public transport services. Thinking more radically, other cities around the world, I think it's a city in Estonia, don't quote me on that. There are definitely cities in the world that are experimenting with making things like bus travel free. And again, seeing this as a cost that needs to be subsidised, that we all need to share this cost. This is a service, the costs of which we can all share, and the benefits of which we can all benefit from. If we're all able to take a bus more regularly, especially if it's an electric or a hydrogen bus, then that's instantly helping with lots of our transport carbon emissions. Other cities have also shown how quickly the change of transport systems can happen. So Paris is like such an interesting example at the moment, where through COVID and through their Green Party mayor Anne Hidalgo, who's currently in the running for the French presidency, has invested massively in cycling infrastructure and essentially just closed down streets to cars overnight. And it has very quickly changed how transport is used in a major global city. And if things like that can happen in Paris, they have businessmen and women who need to get into their offices as well. They have commercial worries, industrial worries about their economy, but they're making these changes and they're seeing the benefits. So
yeah, I think as well in the Liverpool City region with housing, it is worth noting, isn't it? There's a couple of pilot projects on at the moment. So one is the Healthy Homes project, which allows private residents and people who are in rented accommodation to apply and get free work done to make the homes more carbon and energy efficient. I think an ongoing battle, for all of us in the north, as James said, really, is transport for a number of factors. The cost of transport in the northwest is quite prohibitive compared to other places, and I think that is one area where it would be brilliant to get a quick win on that if everyone could agree that we were going to reduce the fare to at least £1.50 return or things like that. So you're thinking around those, and I think some of the pilot projects that we have, really making sure that they're mainstreamed. So instead of that learning finishing at the end of those 2 years, we keep that continuously going, because Liverpool was quite successful with the landlord licensing scheme, and then with the change of government that was scrapped, and I think the City Council were able to bring that in-house. But it's thinking really as well, for me, how do we make these policy interventions longevity? How do we just make sure that they're embedded and that the things that are there and that we can always depend on, they're not something that's going to be 18 months or 2 years in the front and it's taken away. So I think that's one area as well that would be, I don't know how possible this is with changes in government and tensions like that, but if we can see past the election cycle and think, well, this is a long-term issue, so we need to have long-term interventions. And when we know what works, we keep that work going, we don't just stop it.
Thanks both for your talk. I thought it was really interesting as well, especially the asset-based approach in Clubmore. And I think my question then sort of follows on a little bit about systemic change, and I think it's definitely the way forward. I don't think it's possible without. But then to get that is to get some real sort of bottom-up demand for these things. And I feel really pessimistic and really sceptical about lots of things, and it won't come unless it's bottom-up. And then we saw with the film that they had the climate assembly, and people had real shifts in their thinking, in their mindset. And that was just a few, and I was just thinking maybe how do you we're all here and you're almost preaching to the converted, and it feels really frustrating. How do you get the message out? And did you manage to in Clubmore? When you said there were 20 researchers who were talking to people in the community, it's like, how did you get a wide range of views, or was it just people like us who sort of come to these community-based events?
I think in Clubmore there was an advantage in that there was well-established community hubs within the area. So people had connections with St Matthew's Church, they had connections with medical centres. So it sort of spread the word through those. Because another project I was involved in was the evaluation of Liverpool City Region's Household Into Work programme. Now that's a really deceptive title about the Into Work programme, because the aim of the programme is to actually support people who want to transition back into the labour market. But it's more than that. It's actually, as you said there, it was connecting people with the like-minded people and services within the community. And one of the messages I got from that is people felt that they could look on the internet or social media and see an event happening, but they just didn't feel that they could go by themselves to those events. So thinking about the different ways that we break down those barriers and we communicate to people in a way that they feel comfortable. Because I look at our experience, and we moved from a Victorian terrace street to basically there was a housing cooperative. It was a new build estate. And one of the things that was really wonderful about that time was we were able to set up groups, interest groups there. There was things that we shared. It wasn't just about the housing. We had old people's meal clubs, and we had a holiday club and things like that. And we broadened that out to the wider community. But I think now there is, maybe because people have become more isolated over time as well, because that was another thing I've certainly found, is that people become sort of used to either a model where you're either at home all day or you're at work, and so it's hard to bring those opportunities to people in a way that people feel comfortable. Because I'll be honest, if you'd have asked me 10 years ago, would I have come along tonight and given a presentation to a room of strangers, I'd probably have said, no. So it's thinking really, how as people's experiences changes, how do you say to everybody there's a value of your experience, and we want to know more about that, and we share into that, and thinking about as well the connections that you have in the area, how you link up with maybe other groups and other activities that are ongoing. So things, again, with looking back at the experience with households, that programme started off and they were told, you go and you meet people via the job centre, and they were like, actually, they tried that for a few months, but that didn't work. So they went into different Sure Start centres, they went to different community activity that was related to churches. So I think it's very much trying to find those connections and taking yourself to a place where people feel comfortable. I'm sorry, I know that's not an easy answer, but that's just the way I would think about it really, is what other organisations could you link up within the area what ways could we make people feel comfortable about participation, because it's certainly not a natural fit for everyone. I know it's not a natural fit for me. So,
and I think facilitating that as well. So one of the things that we are planning for the climate change, mini climate change assemblies here in terms of the funding bit is, for example, to incorporate a creche for that, so that kids can come and leave the kids in the creche, and you know, things like that as well.
Yeah, it is all these small things. I think that's why travel is something that's really important to me, because I think the cost of travel for people is such a barrier in participating into things too. And if you factor in, you know, that people have got children and it's £1.50 on the bus for the child and it's £2.50 for adults, you know, you've spent £10 just getting to a place, get there and back to a place. So thinking as well around venues and the wraparound, I suppose.
And I think just to add, I completely agree with you. It can often feel really sort of disempowering and dispiriting, kind of to feel that there is this huge global problem that us as individuals, by ourselves, can do very little to solve, especially when, you know, like the graph I showed, that rapid and intensifying climate change. I think Belinda is absolutely right around how can we cultivate a kind of better and more proactive sort of sense of citizenship, where we do feel as citizens in a democratic country we can collectively kind of take a bit more control over these processes, and rather than kind of relying on the goodwill or discretion of government to kind of do the right thing. But I also think it's kind of, there are opportunities to kind of demonstrate what systemic change looks like at a local level within neighbourhoods and communities. And I think by demonstrating it, you can show to other places that there's a model that can be replicated, that it's easy, that it's something to be excited about, and it's, you know, that there is that opportunity to feel positive that change is possible. And then I think also, you know, a thought I had watching the film was we've seen over the last few years that for better or for worse, and I'm sure we all have opinions on it, the Brexit referendum was a way that really changed this country very, very quickly. It changed our sort of economic, our political settlement that had been in place for decades, and it changed it very quickly. Why are we not putting the recommendations of that climate assembly to a public referendum to allow everyone in the country to be having the kinds of discussions around their dinner table that we all had around the Brexit referendum, or that those people were having around the discussion table in Birmingham? Maybe that's something that kind of local organisations can be asking of their local government and their national government, that these kind of things need to be part of a public discussion, and you know, giving that public mandate to politicians to lead that change and be bold, as was recommended in the film.
Further questions?
Hi, I agree. Yeah, it's like, obviously systemic change needs to happen. I've got like a personal and professional interest in these changes, and just from my understanding, the updated Liverpool local plan has been in draft since like 2016 or 2018. Obviously, from the film and your talks, so you've demonstrated that these changes need to happen quicker than they are happening. So what can we do on like an individual level and a community level to really push these policies to be adopted? And what does that look like? Not just, we need to get together and do this, like as in like, how can we really make it be adopted?
I think what's interesting about that is we have within the city roots into the council to speak to councillors and have that dialogue, and I think it's pressing in on those roots personally. I look at the experience. Sorry, I know we keep bringing this back today, but I look at the experience of the housing cooperative that we lived in, and basically, you know, we went from being told, you know, your entire neighbourhood is going to be demolished and broken up, and people well, children will have to change school, you'll be moved to areas where, you know, you don't know anyone, you haven't got those family connections and things like that. And basically, it was a case that, you know, through forums like this, people got together and they shaped the dialogue, a bit like the assemblies there, really. And thought, well, you know, these are the things that we feel are important for you to know as our elected members. And, you know, these are the things that we would like to see happen with us. And then I think it was a case of thinking, well, you know, we know there are these models from other places that work, so certainly with the housing cooperative and certainly as well, we look at the work that we did with my club role. We know that there's good models there that we could try and replicate, and we know as well that some of these models are actually backed up by really good evidence. So for a policy maker, part of, I think, the picture might be drawing down additional funding to make those changes, but then part of it as well is presenting that case for evidence and keep, I suppose, building on that case for evidence with the activities, you know, that you've done. Because I think that's the other thing as well, isn't it? It's thinking about, well, with my club more, you know, people said, oh, well, we feel our community's grown stronger as a result of the pandemic, because we've done different work and supported each other and set up neighbourhood groups. Because that was one of the things I found interesting last year. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Hilary Cotton wrote a book a while ago called Radical Help, and she's running different projects across the country, one of which is called Participle, and the Participle model's being replicated and there's been changes to local policy with that. But one of the things she said that really struck me was the government had that big call for volunteers, and people did come forward to do that work, but actually the most demand and most successful work were those community WhatsApp groups that were set up. So I think the past year has given us messages about people power and community power, and it's how we then use that evidence to help inform policy and say, you know, if we're here, this is what we're doing. We have expertise, it's our lived experience. You know, you should listen to us because basically we know what works in our community. We know the things, the changes that we could make. We can see the changes that our friends and family could make. Because I think what was really interesting about the film was thinking, well, before people even got to Birmingham, they'd had some type of journey there to make them want to sign up to that assembly. And it was just interesting to see that range of different backgrounds and a range of views. So it's thinking about, there is these experiences out there, how do we use these experiences? And the way to do that, I think, is as well to have that dialogue with local elected members. I'm sure you do this anyway, sorry. But so they know what's going on in their area and they know those things that are important, because I found out about Love Wavertree because I'd seen the campaign about the old supermarket and the proposal for Lidl, and you know, I knew that people didn't want that demolition to happen. So for me it's thinking, well, you know, you've sent that message out there and there's been that pause on that, so then how do we keep that going? It is just presenting back that evidence of, well, you know, these things are working elsewhere. You know, these things are saving money in some way in the public purse. So let's try them.
I would say, yeah, I completely agree, and I would say kind of the mantras should be organise but also scrutinise. So you were saying around the local plan that's been in development, when that is finally published, I think, you know, groups like this should be scrutinising it in the same way that, you know, our chambers of commerce and our trade unions and those kind of organisations will be scrutinising it for the benefit of their membership and their interests. Groups like this should be doing the same, and that requires work. But I think it can pay dividends because you know, it's easy to be pessimistic, but people do often want to listen to their constituents and they do want to make a difference. And people do get into politics for the right reasons. I think when kind of scrutinising these documents, I think it's really important to think about, as you were sort of saying, that level of looking beyond what other places are doing and setting setting that international ambition for communities in this city, and thinking, you know, if it's working elsewhere, if there's interesting models, why can't we be trying those here? But I also think it's really important to think about the coherency of a lot of these strategies. So often there'll be, you know, lovely kind of strategic narrative around the need to hit net zero carbon, and, you know, there's good words around how important it is, but often that doesn't align with some of the policy decisions that are being made or the policy priorities that are being set out later in these documents. So I think it's about taking people at good faith and trying to, you know, working with them and showing that you're kind of passionate, engaged, knowledgeable about what's happening in the wider world, and also about, you know, if places like Liverpool City Region are saying we want to hit net zero carbon by 2040, then, you know, engage with the work that they're doing and work with them where it's either not meeting their own aspirations or where there are real opportunities to realise those ambitions in places like Wavertree.
Gentleman back wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering where our energy is best placed in terms of making an impact, and whether, so it sounds like there's been quite a lot of success stories in Clubmore, whether there's been any specifically Wavertree success stories with any sort of issues around, you know, specifically this area.
So, can I just check, I got that you were talking about where energy might be best placed to make an impact? Yeah. I think it is, it's multiple things, isn't it, really, I suppose, that we have to try and think through. And some of it is some of those small scale change projects that we could do and you could play a part in. So whether, you know, a first step for yourselves, and it seems like a reasonable idea, is to try that assembly approach. And that's a good way to focus people's energy and start to bring together some thoughts about what the area is. Because one thing, I think James touched on it there, I'm sure we've all read a lot of policy documents where people have talked about vibrant, sustainable communities and things like that. Then there might be those policies aren't necessarily written by those people in the communities, and that might not be the terminology that relates to people. And I think having the assembly approach and maybe looking at different issues and seeing as well how people want to use their skills in the community as well, because, you know, as a collective, you know, there might be, you know, 40 or 50 years of lived experience in a specific field, there might be 1,000 years of lived experience in a field. So really, I think as a first step, it's always useful to bring people together and, you know, discuss those issues. Because I've seen as well, one of the things I liked about your webpage was the ideas post-its. So I think that's a really good way to get some dialogue there. And I think as a first step, it is making those connections with people and trying to find out where's the common ground, you know, which things can we agree on in our group, which things do we need to maybe change, what is our narrative, because our narrative maybe isn't, you know, sitting down and writing something about a vibrant economy. Our narrative might be something completely different about why we like the area, you know, what is it that we like about the area, what do we feel is needed in the area, you know, would it be nice? It was one of the things I thought that was really interesting on the webpage was the comments someone had made about the shop frontages. And those tiny things, so I think it is the first step, is that coming together, and I think focusing the energy on maybe setting up those chances for people to speak to each other.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think no action can happen unless we're working together, right? So I think energy should be going into things like a local climate assembly. Not only is that, as you say, a way to find out kind of what people want, what people can do locally, but it also acts as that evidence base that you can then take to politicians and say, look, we've organised locally, this is what we want to see, this is what we can help you to deliver at a local level, this is, you know, it provides that kind of legitimacy and backing, and but also kind of incentive and push factor that will make sure that kind of elected officials and government officials are watching what they say and what they do, I suppose.
Can I just follow up on that? How do we get a climate assembly for like a Wavertree climate assembly? Has that happened? Can that happen?
We're in the process of applying for funding from the lottery. The deadline to hand in that funding bit is the 18th of November. We have to wait 12 weeks to find out if we got the money. But if we do get the money, and I think we have a good chance because the funding pot is precisely for stuff like this, then we're basically going to invite the whole of the community via community groups. But also, one of the ways they did it in the film was actually write to people, and we've budgeted that in basically. And I've got a few people already lined up to deliver those letters basically. So hopefully it will happen here hopefully in this room. Yeah. And if you want to come. Yeah. Sorry. We'll probably have time for one short last question. But it's also 9:30 and tomorrow is a school night. So can we thank Belinda and James again for that? Thank you all for coming. We won't have another screening before Christmas, but we have two beautiful events planned before Christmas. A Christmas switch on of lights on the High Street on the 4th of December. Watch out for that. And on the 12th of December, we're hoping to have a Christmas Wonderland. And there will also be a tractor parade again, I saw earlier today. So lots of stuff happening before Christmas, basically. The screenings will start back in the new year. Have a lovely evening, and thank you again for coming.